I'm going to cover 7 points of preliminary due diligence for buying an e-commerce business. So let's say you want to buy an e-commerce business like La Siesta Hammocks here. These are things that you should check out before you make an offer on the business. Now, as a prerequisite to this video, I did this video last week here, website acquisitions, 9 points of preliminary due diligence. And in that video, I spoke broadly on things you should check out on online businesses of all sorts. So this video here, the 9 points of preliminary due diligence for website acquisitions, is kind of like a baseline to this video where I'm going to cover e-commerce businesses specifically. Now, that said, before we jump into it, I also need to make it known that I have no affiliation with La Siesta Hammocks here. I was just looking for an example. I thought about hammocks and I typed in hammocks for sale and ended up at this website. So if I do make any examples or analogies, I'm going to be making them using La Siesta Hammocks just as an example, and keep in mind I'm not in any way affiliated with them. I'm not associated with them. I do not know if their business is for sale. To my knowledge, it is not for sale. This is just something that I'm doing kind of randomly here with an example website I found online. Now let's jump into it. 7 points of preliminary due diligence for e-commerce businesses. There should be an E right there. Not going to do that. There should be an E right there. Okay, first and foremost, what are they selling? What is the business selling? That can be a little tricky to understand because in some businesses, what they are actually selling is not necessarily what you think that they're selling. So relating to La Siesta Hammocks here, we look at the website and we're like, okay, this business sells hammocks. But what if 60% of their business comes from these suspension setup kits? Like, what if they are literally just selling the shit out of these suspension setup kits? Fundamentally, at this point, they are in the business of not selling hammocks. They're in the business of selling hardware and accessories. And I actually ran across an e-commerce business like this just a couple of weeks ago. It was a business that was an appliance business on the front end, right? You looked like this is where you came to buy appliances, but very specifically, about 60% of their businesses was coming from a very specific, or about 60% of their business was coming from a very, very specific repair part. It would be like saying, here's this website that sells washers and dryers, and oh, by the way, 60% of our business comes from selling replacement doors for the washer and dryers. At that point, you're really not in the business of washers and dryers, you're really in the business of repair parts. Okay, so oftentimes, I'm going to say often because this is not uncommon in the e-commerce world, what you see when you look at the website is not necessarily what is actually being sold. And generally, there's an 80-20 rule, right? Where 20% of the products are responsible for 80% of the sales. And those 20% of products, again, are not necessarily what's being sold. In this case here at La Siesta Hammocks, they could be selling a shitload of these mounting kits. I don't know. This is just all completely made up for example purposes, but legitimately that appliance business that I looked at, appliance e-commerce business I looked at a couple of weeks ago, was literally selling 60% of their revenue, or getting 60% of their revenue from what was essentially a repair part for these appliances. It's not a deal breaker in any case. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something you really need to understand before you go forward and proceed through the acquisitions process. Next, what are the traffic sources? And what sources are really driving sales? Is it organic SEO from Google? Is it Facebook ads? Is it Instagram ads? Is it Pinterest ads? Is it Google ads? Is it YouTube ads? Is it TikTok ads? Is it Snapchat ads? You really need to understand where the sales are coming from and subsequently why. This is not uncommon to see businesses that are started by somebody that is incredibly experienced in one advertising channel, and they just kind of start something up, or they start many things up, and one of them takes off, and they're just selling a ton of product from, say, Facebook ads. Now, like what they're actually selling, that's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it's something that you really, really need to understand before you make an offer. In other words, and why is it important to understand? Let's just talk about that. Are you going to be able to continue that advertising channel? Have they exploited that advertising channel? That's a big one, a really big one. Or are they getting close to exploiting it? Because something can kind of pop up and do really well in one market or one market on a specific channel. For example, let's just say that you are selling weighted blankets with Facebook ads and you're running weighted blankets on Facebook ads and you find success, you scale it up. Next thing you know, the business is doing a couple $1,000,000 a year in revenue and it's making a healthy margin and your ad spend cost is low. Is that going to be sustainable going forward? Or are you literally going to, or have you nearly reached the saturation point where you've sold weighted blankets to nearly everyone in that market that had a strong urge or demand for it, and then the ultimate cost of advertising is going to go up, your return on ad spend is going to go down because, a function of that is increasing so rapidly. That does happen. And that's why I like to stick with online businesses that have been around for at least 5 years. That will typically filter out these kind of sudden surge in demand from a specific traffic source type of businesses. Namely, over the last few years, I've seen a lot of them with Facebook ads. Incredible return on ad spends are simply put not sustainable. So it's important that you understand what the traffic source is for that reason, to make sure you're avoiding that, or at least going into it knowing that and knowing that, hey, maybe there is room to scale. And then also, so you know what you can do differently. All right. And again, this is something I say in a lot of videos. You should always have multiple traffic sources for an online business. Next up, what is the returns rate? And by returns, I am talking about returns of product. In this case, how many cost amounts are coming back from La Siesta, how many hammocks are getting returned on a monthly basis. And sometimes you will see this excluded or not included, I shouldn't say excluded, but not included in the financials that you review for a business. Going back to that appliance repair business example, they had no returns on their income statement, or the appliance e-commerce business. They were not doing repairs. They were selling parts, largely a repair part, and they were selling new appliances as well. But on the financial statement, there was no line item for returns. And I'm looking at this, I'm going, okay, this thing's doing $2 million a year in revenue. Are you really telling me that they have no returns? Right? That just does not make sense. Every e-commerce business of any size will have returns. So you always want to know what that return rate is before you go in and make an offer, or maybe you won't find that out until you make an offer. Actually, I'm going to take that back. You should find that out before you make an offer, because before you make an offer, you should get fairly detailed financials, and that should include the returns rate. If I ran across an e-commerce business and they will not give me the returns rate so I can legitimately make an offer, I probably wouldn't do anything. I mean, I'd have to be really, really into this business. I'd have to be in love with this thing. And then I would say, hey, I'm going to make an offer, but let me tell you, there's going to be an adjustment on this offer based on whatever the returns rate is, or I may pull out when I find out the returns rate, especially if it makes a material difference to the net income. But returns can kill an e-commerce business, like hard. If you got a product that is requires user setup or requires fit with some other type of product or some type of integration, people will open it up, fuck around with the product, not be able to get it working properly, and then return it. And I know I've done that as a consumer, and that is very, very detrimental to e-commerce businesses. My favorite e-commerce businesses are ones that plug and play and work right outside the box. And I got to say, hammocks as a business is probably very simple. And the reason why hammocks came to mind, total side note here, the reason why hammocks came to mind is several years ago, maybe in like 2015 or 2016, I looked at getting into the hammock market because there's a very low rate of returns in there. They're easy to ship. They're lightweight. Like this hammock here can just be rolled up and smushed into a box. It's very small and can go anywhere, and it's going to weigh less than a pound or two. So yeah, I did like the hammocks as a business model, and I still think about that, which is why in this example I did come back to hammocks to find an example. So I guess it wasn't totally random. Like in the beginning of this video, I said just a totally random example. No, not totally random. I did have a bit of an inkling to get into the hammock business. I did not do anything with that, but still think about it. Okay, next up, what about sales tax? Again, a lot of small e-commerce businesses are not collecting sales tax, and that is illegal. Right? They're in violation typically of some state laws. I am not an expert on sales tax for e-commerce businesses because I just have not been in the e-commerce space for a very long time. From 2009 to 2012, I did run an e-commerce business and ultimately sold that in 2012. But since then, I have not been in the e-commerce space. To my understanding, if you have a nexus, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, correct me in the comments, because this has been several years since I've looked at this, but if you have a nexus, meaning that product physically touches ground in another point as a means of supplying it to your consumers, you have to pay sales tax in that location. So if I am in Florida operating the business and I sell in Florida, I think I have to pay sales tax in Florida. If my supplier's in Arizona and Georgia and somebody else is in Arizona and Georgia, I have to also pay sales tax there. I could be wrong on that, but I know that in the documents and financials for many e-commerce businesses, they're just not collecting sales tax anywhere. So how will sales tax impact you as the buyer is what you really need to consider. Let's just say I'm looking at buying a company that sells bikinis and they're in Delaware, and Delaware I think has no sales tax. They're shipping these things out of Delaware. Now, if I buy the business and I live here in Florida, and most of the business is happening here in Florida, right? Like 90% of their $2 million a year in sales or whatever is coming in Florida. They haven't had to pay sales tax on that. Well, I'm here in Florida. Guess what I got to do? I got to register, collect, and pay sales tax. That is something I would want to account for before I made an offer on the business. And next up, how is the product sourced? And I should further elaborate by saying, is that source sustainable? Okay, so where are these hammocks coming from? Are these hammocks that can be made anywhere? Are they coming from a very specific supplier that could cut you off? That's what you really want to avoid, is selling products that come from one specific supplier that is hard to switch to another supplier. Because if that supplier cuts their relationships with you, or if they just want to jack up the price because it is cheaper for them to produce injection molded plastic frames for monitors, or more profitable for them to produce injection molded plastic frames for computer monitors than it is to produce hammocks, are they going to just drop you or really jack up your prices? You have to understand that. I will say, based on my experience looking into the hammock model, you can get hammocks created in many different places. What else do I got on my keynote? Hey, that's the first time I said keynote and not PowerPoint. I'm fully becoming a Mac fanboy. I've been on a Mac since 2017 and absolutely love it. Next up, finally here, and this is not so much a point of due diligence as it is a point of proactivity. A point of proactivity, a plan for improvement. Okay, so I say this a lot. I would never buy a business that I don't have a plan for actively improving the business once I get into it. And I can make a whole video on all of these things. What could we improve? You can improve or get new customer acquisition channels, so different traffic sources. You can improve the conversion rate of the website. You could lower the cost of goods sold, maybe find alternate suppliers, increase customer lifetime value. So maybe they buy a hammock and in 6 months you sell them another hammock. I don't know how you do that in hammocks. It kind of seems like you buy a hammock and then you're done. Maybe you encourage them to buy their spouse a gift for their spouse's birthday, and that's a hammock. Not sure. But anyways, that's something you could consider. Or maybe you improve shipping time. This goes back to that appliance business I was talking about. Shipping time was like 6 to 8 weeks. And I'm like, holy shit, people wait 6 to 8 weeks. Then it kind of makes sense. They need this repair part. They can't find these repair parts anywhere else. They'll wait 6 to 8 weeks for that repair part. So guys, that is what I have for you. That is my 7 points, I believe. What is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points of preliminary due diligence for e-commerce businesses. If you found this one helpful and insightful, be sure to do me a sweet one, hit that like button, and do yourself a sweet one and hit that subscribe button so that you get all of my latest insight on e-business. That's a wrap. I'm signing off.